Continue. No.
No worries.
All right. Aha.
There we go.
All right. I'm trying to find a less cluttery background for you.
Well, this worked out fine because it took me a minute to get signed on myself.
Okay.
I'm like, what's going on here? Is my internet provider acting foolish today or what?
Well, I'll take all the blame because I thought all week long I'm saying I got to prepare for Wednesday, and I should have double checked, but that's all right. We're here, and thank you for your patience. You're a very gracious host.
Not a problem. Well, I'd like to officially welcome you to Clergy Talk Podcast. I have to use my catchphrase, the world wants to know. And if you would, please introduce yourself to my audience.
Well, thank you, Michael. My name is Kathleen L Maher. That's my writing name. You can call me Kathy. Okay. And I write historical fiction, but it's based on historical truth. We just add elements of story into, the background of a historical time setting.
Right.
So
right.
My favorite time period is the Civil War and Reconstruction. And I see so many themes that keep recurring in modern times.
Yes.
And so that's my background.
Okay. Well, as a Christian pastor, I try to encourage pastors to clean the slate, to talk about what happened, give both perspectives, because during that time frame, like I've said this a million times before, we had three types of Christians.
Yes.
Those that fought against slavery, those that said, well, since it's legal, what's wrong with it? And those that said, well, I'm just not going to get involved,
Wow.
And when we look at that historically, it supports all three perspectives, because we had like major church splits over that issue. And me as a pastor, of course, I focused for a long time on the Christian freedom fighters, and I kind of ignored the ugly part for a while. I said, Mike, you got to address this because somebody's going to ask you about it.
Yes.
And if you don't have no answers, it's kind of like messes up your credibility because you're avoiding something that happened historically.
Yes, that's profound. I think a lot of times, I'm also a Christian, devout Christian, and I think a lot of times our culture likes to focus on Pleasantville, if you don't mind me using that.
Yeah. That's always a nice place to be at.
It is, but God redeemed us all from something, and it wasn't all pretty. So we have to talk about, some of the darkness in order to magnify his light. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think, with the issue of abolition, especially, I don't think we can sweep that hard history under the rug. We have to talk about these things. And, I feel a little self-conscious as a suburban white woman talking about this.
It's okay.
But I love history, and I love reading about, William Still and, Harriet Tubman and these heroes that risked everything. And, I grew up in a town called Elmira, New York, and it has some very negative history for Southerners because we hosted a Confederate prisoner of war camp here.
Wow.
But we also had some amazing history because the Underground Railroad was very active through Elmira. Okay. And there was a gentleman that escaped slavery from Virginia and found his way to Elmira in, I think it was the late 1840s.
Okay.
And his name was John W. Jones. And he came to settle in Elmira. And I would love to tell his story because I think he's one of these unsung heroes. He was very much like a Harriet Tubman. He's credited with rescuing 800 people from slavery, men, women, children. And if it weren't for some of, suburban white people that helped him along the way, we have to look at ourselves as a family, the body of Christ.
Right.
And these were just people helping people. And that, but John W. Jones, of course, was an African-American man. And I believe it was his nephew, I think he escaped with his nephew and a couple of other people. And he was the one that settled here in Elmira. He was helped by a judge and some of the local abolitionists. They established him. They helped him get an education. And he ended up working for the Baptist Church, First Baptist, and he was well regarded. Everyone loved John. He was everything I've read about him. He was charming. He was polite. He was intelligent. He was a very hard worker. He worked full time for the church, and he also helped with the church cemetery, and which led him during the Civil War to get a job with the United States government burying the Confederate dead that died in the prisoner of war camp. So before the Civil War, our country was dealing with the laws where slave catchers could come up north and recapture escaped people and bring them back. You know, I should have looked at my notes. Everyone knows what I'm referencing, and my brain isn't firing. They were laws that allowed them to come back.
Right.
So Elmira was actually an early version of a sanctuary city, if you will. So the people of the town would not tolerate these slave catchers coming into Elmira, and they would literally form a physical barrier to allow them to try to get any of their citizens and return them into slavery.
Wow, that was brave.
It really was. And so you had some somewhat famous people that lived here. Everyone has heard of Mark Twain. Well, Mark Twain married into an Elmira family. He married a young lady named Olivia Langdon, and the Langdon family were staunch abolitionists. And you talked earlier about how it caused church splits. Well, let's talk about that. The Presbyterian church that the Langdons were one of the founding members for ended up splitting over the issue of abolition. And so they formed a congregational church, which ultimately became Park Church in Elmira. And so the Langdons and several other prominent families at that time split away, and they recruited a somewhat famous name to be their pastor. Everyone's heard of Henry Ward Beecher, and if not him, they've heard of his sister, Harriet Beecher Stowe. So we ended up having the brother. We have Thomas K. Beecher, who became the pastor of this congregational church.
Wow.
And he was a great man in his own right. So he fully embraced abolition, and he allowed it to flourish under his pastorate. And so do you have any specific questions? Because I could go in multiple directions.
Well, start with the story about this guy that I never heard of.
Right.
I read a whole bunch of stuff on it because this is like the third and final episode of my series, Christianity and Slavery, and I've hit two perspectives. I wanted to close off with that perspective that you're bringing to the table. So you just go ahead and you take this show in any direction you want to take it in.
All right. Thank you for your grace. So John W. Jones, as he was established in Elmira, he also he was also employed for the local railroad. Elmira was a rail town. We were connected north all the way to Canada, south all the way to Baltimore, and east to west as well. Eventually, we were connected from New York City out to Chicago. So we were a hub. And I think that's why the military chose Elmira for their rendezvous, the military rendezvous and the Civil War prison camp, because we were so well connected. So he was employed, I believe he handled baggages. He loaded and unloaded, and he worked the graveyard shift. So he had very, very few people looking over his shoulder. So he would both receive slaves that came up on the midnight train, and he would also send some out up to Canada through Canandaigua all the way up to, I want to say it was Niagara where they landed, but I could be mistaken on that point, but it went all the way, and he would hide these souls on the baggage train. So it was literally the Underground Railroad in Elmira's case was literally on a railroad.
Wow.
Which is neat. Yeah.
How about that?
Yeah, and he and his wife lived not far from the Elmira Depot on Railroad Ave. They lived next to the Baptist church because he was the custodian. And so he could actually hide people in his home. They could, come off the train in the middle of the night, no one would see, and until they were ready to move on.
Okay.
So he would shelter them in his own home, feed them, care for them, and send them on to freedom, where no slave catcher could come, regardless of the laws. So he and his wife sacrificed greatly, but they had all of this wonderful support. So at the same time, all of this was happening in the 1850s. Elmira, when I use the word progressive, it doesn't mean what it means today.
Yeah, because it changed altogether. It's crazy meaning now.
So Elmira was a progressive town in the 1800s, and that was a good thing because of things like women's rights, even animal welfare, things that were biblical. Now progressivism has gone beyond the pale and way beyond, biblical values. But back in the day, it meant something good and redeeming. So as part of our progressive culture in the 1800s, we were the first female college, Elmira Female College, to give women the opportunity to earn the same baccalaureate degree as men.
That's good.
There were other, institutions in the country like Oberlin and Vassar that were educating women, but Elmira Female College was the first to offer them the same exact baccalaureate. So you had a lot of the Elmira Female College founders that were also abolitionists. So these causes were intertwined. It was, the human plight and how can we better people's lives. And
so people don't talk about that though. I never heard anybody talk about that.
Well, that's, it's so vital to understand because these were all rooted deeply, fundamentally in Christianity and Jesus's teachings.
Okay.
Do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
Right.
To give a man or a woman opportunity that they didn't have otherwise is inherently Christian, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Well, I want to jump in real quick in 1 second. The Quakers, they called them heretics, but they were actually the first group that fought against slavery. They had the very first group to stand up against slavery. And during their church meetings, they even allowed women to stand up and speak.
There you go.
Yeah.
Again, progressivism in a biblical sense that they could see the value of every person and give them a voice, give them hope, give them a future. I mean, isn't that what the Lord says? He says, I've come to give you a hope and a future. And I've come to give you life abundantly. It's the enemy who comes to steal, kill, and destroy. Right. And without that hope, we couldn't do good. We would, there's one of my favorite scriptures is in Proverbs. I should have looked it up, but I believe it's Proverbs 12:10 or thereabouts. And it says, a righteous man cares for the well-being of his animals. I'm a pet lover, but this is the part that's so good. Even the kindness of the ungodly is cruelty. Now that's something to chew on because they mean well.
That's deep.
They mean well. People without the Lord mean well, but sometimes their well-meaning is misguided and it ends up causing harm.
Yes.
And so with the abolitionist movement, with the great people I mentioned before, William Stills out of Baltimore, and people who were so committed that they laid their lives on the line, Frederick Douglass, these people have had a deep faith, a deep abiding faith in the Lord, and it drove them to be willing to say, my life here doesn't even matter. It's only what I can do to advance the gospel and advance, the brotherhood of humanity. They inspire us today.
Right. And a lot of people don't realize, depending on where they lived at, their life was under extreme danger all the time.
Yes. They
could get kicked out the church. They could get their house burned down. Mm-hmm. They could get hung from a tree like everyone else, Yes. And a lot of people fail to talk about that aspect of it. Because, when I have this conversation with people who really haven't studied it, they're either one-dimensional. They'll give you one dimension, but they won't look at the whole entire, field to say, okay, this was going on over here. This group was doing that, and this group risked everything to end something that was basically wrong for the country.
And that's what's so remarkable. I don't want to malign. I have many friends from the South that are struggling with this still. I think they acknowledge, of course, that slavery was wrong, but I think they feel very sensitive when we start getting regional, and I understand that because there were bad Northerners, there were good Southerners,
exactly,
and I understand that. So I want to be careful not to offend, by making broad, sweeping statements.
Right.
But where the culture, by and large, accepted evil, people were more likely than not to turn their eyes away, even if they opposed it. But then again, there were those who lived their conscience. There were Southerners that fought for the Union, for example. There were even Northerners that fought for the South. I think they called them Copperheads. Yeah.
It was spread out pretty crazy all over the place.
That's true. So back to John W. Jones. Here's my favorite part of his story. Even though he led over 800 souls to freedom, there was something he did that actually it almost defies. Only God could motivate a man to so forgive those. Excuse me. Little bit of lingering cold here. Excuse me. So sorry. So when he was working for the federal government, but that just won't go away. When he was working for the federal government, burying the Confederate dead that perished in Elmira prison war camp, he actually ran across a familiar name, and it was the overseer of the farm that he had formerly worked in Virginia.
Wow.
The Elseys, their last name were the Elseys, and they were from Northern Virginia. And the woman who owned, I actually hate using that term, but under that law at that time.
Right. It's history.
Right. So the woman, Sally Elsey, John W. Jones said she was always kind, he was never beaten or, but the fact was he was his own human being. He didn't need to be owned by anybody. So some people will try to justify slavery by saying, well, owners weren't always cruel. Slavery in itself is cruel.
Exactly.
So this overseer, he perished in Elmira as a prisoner of war. And when John W. Jones saw that his name, instead of putting him into a grave in Elmira, which he was hired to do, he took it upon himself to contact the Elsey family and say, I have your relative here. I would like to arrange to transport his body so that he could be buried at home.
Wow.
What an act of grace and forgiveness and going above and beyond. So this is the kind of man that John W. Jones was. He not only survived and overcame for himself and other slaves, but he showed the kind of forbearance that only Christ could inspire to show grace and love.
I'm not even sure if I could do that,
I don't think I could.
I think about it, so well, Mike, could you do that? I'm like, I don't know. It would take the hand of God have to move upon me, to say you have to do this, so.
And another point in that, and this is a minor point compared to that, but at that time period, there were many other prisons of war. There was Point Lookout in Chicago. There was Andersonville down in the South in Georgia.
Right.
There and almost in every case, the prisoners that perished in those camps were mass buried in mass graves, and there were no individual tombs. There were no individual markings. John W. Jones took fastidious records. He recorded every man's name, where he was from, what rank he served,
Wow.
the division, whether it was cavalry or infantry or
Right.
artillery. He made notes, and to this day, all of those graves that he and his team dug are marked with every name. I think there might be, out of 2,000, there might be 3 unknowns, and that was
Wow.
probably because of something that was beyond his control.
Right.
So he was remarkable because
Wow.
he gave each of these men, whether they deserved it or not, a proper burial,
Right.
so that their families could at least know where they lay.
Right.
So,
And I can relate to that, being a Marine Corps and Army vet. I did 2 services, so I really relate to that, you know, and how important that is for a family to know where their loved one is after a war is over, you know, and so on and so forth, you know.
Right. And so, like I said, there were approximately 2,000 men that perished here. Elmira actually had the highest death rate of the whole war for a prison camp. They were actually worse than Andersonville.
Wow.
And it could be argued that, you know, at that point, the Confederacy was bankrupt. They may not have been able to afford to feed their prisoners. There's some debate there. But certainly up north, we would have had the largesse. We would have had, I mean, Elmira is situated in what was a very lush farmland.
Okay.
We had an abundance, and there was no excuse. These men died of starvation. They died of exposure. They died of disease because the engineers actually allowed the latrine to be right next to the drinking water, and they knew what they were doing. So it's been argued that it was a retaliatory move on the government's part to have this camp here and to run it the way they did. But the bright spot in all this, again, goes back to John W. Jones, who had more reason to hate and to be bitter, and yet he's shown the love of the Lord and the forgiveness.
Right. Wow.
So my passion is to see Elmira the way it really was, because, you know, there have been, you know, Northern historians that have sugarcoated some of the bad things, but then there have been those who have not, you know, sung the unsung heroes, you know, song. John W. Jones deserves as much credit as any of these ones that are household names, and I would love to see his story known. There is actually a museum that a lady has founded. Well, not just her, but a whole league of people, but I'll mention her name. Her name is Talima Aaron, and she has been instrumental in taking his old home, which still exists, and they moved it not even a quarter of a mile so that it sits in a nice open field. They've restored it to its original condition because it had been, you know, reconstructed over the years. So she restored it, she and her team. So the John W. Jones Museum is right next to Woodlawn National Cemetery, where he buried these soldiers. And if anyone in your audience is ever in Elmira, you're going to definitely want to see the John W. Jones Museum. And just want to mention, you know, Talima's hard work, and you know, take my hat off to her. I'm just before COVID struck last year, I was supposed to come and help be a docent for the museum. I'm eager to help with that. But so in my, I'll just mention my books really quickly.
Please do.
Oh, thank you. And only because I had the pleasure and the artistic liberty to make John W. Jones a minor character.
Okay.
So it was just a fun experience to insert him into, you know, give him dialogue and show, you know, the world who this person was. And so he, in addition to all of his other endeavors, he was a farmer. He was a wealthy man. He was very good with his money that he earned. He was actually, I believe, the 10th most wealthy African-American man for his time in the United States.
Wow.
And he bought acreage and he farmed it, and he provided opportunities for others. So so he had this farm, and they preserved his home, and it's now his museum right next to his life's work.
Wow, that's amazing.
It is. It is. So I'm just delighted to have this opportunity to talk about him. And so he plays this minor role in my book. My book is called The Abolitionist's Daughter.
Okay.
And it is the book one in a series called Sons of the Shenandoah.
Okay.
And so in that book, I take a snapshot of the Southern family. And there are 4 brothers, and this book is about twin brothers. They're right in the middle. They're neither the oldest nor the youngest. And one of the twins fights for the North, and one of the twins fights for the South. So, and it divided families. We know, they called it the war between the states, but they also call it brother against brother, and
yes,
that's very much what it was. And doesn't it seem familiar nowadays, because we have politics so extreme that families are divided almost along the same lines?
Right, exactly.
And I have a dear brother whom I love, that for a while we weren't on speaking terms because our politics were different. But, I think we still loved one another, but maybe we were a little guarded what to say.
Right, exactly. And it really got crazy during this last election and stuff. And I'm pretty sure I kind of went extreme on a couple of issues and stuff. But when I look back at it, I said to myself, what am I doing? This is, all Christians are supposed to be united. And the Bible says the world is against Christians because they hated Jesus, so they'll hate you too. So I don't even know how it got crazy. I guess people just ignored the Bible and started going with their feelings and emotions and politics, which is never good. When you start ignoring biblical principles, it always goes south.
That's very well said. I think we do. We put our emotions and our feelings and ourselves on a pedestal above what the word says. I've been guilty of it, certainly. And you're right. We have to come back to what God has said about these matters. And one of my passions. So I'm just about to release book 3 in this series.
Okay.
And I'm still with that theme of slavery, but broadening it out, because we're slaves to sin, we're slaves to sometimes government oppression.
Right.
So in book 3, I'm exploring human trafficking as it affected women. And
no, that's a hot topic.
It is,
and people are not talking about it. It's just there's only a handful of people who are talking about it. And in Georgia, human trafficking is a real big issue.
Yes. And we all love our coffee. We all love our Apple products. All of those things are harvested and made with slave labor, modern slavery.
Exactly.
And I'm convicted. I'll hold up my iPhone. How guilty am I?
Right.
How is the Lord going to hold me accountable for buying into markets that exploit other human beings? And so it's not just, the actual trafficking, but it's, keeping people in picking coffee beans or chocolate or, some of the things that we take for granted as blessed Americans. We never give it a second thought.
Right.
So
I mean, there was organizations that were exposing all these groups all the time, and somehow or another they kind of like faded away. I don't know whether they got paid off or what. I don't know what happened.
Right. And so it's almost so pervasive that it's hard to wash ourselves clean of it.
Right.
But I think the Lord would have us, work on what we do know, not to forget what we've already attained to, and to just challenge ourselves. How it's not just ancient history, but it's happening now. And so I'm so inspired and captivated by the whole subject of abolition. And I think, I would be a hypocrite to write about it 160 years ago when I'm not living it in my own life.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Right.
So, do you have any other questions about John W. Jones?
Well, tell me about the book series, and how did you get inspired to start this book series, and what was the whole inspirational spark that made you want to go into this?
It was definitely local history.
Okay.
Elmira is very proud of their Mark Twain ties, of course. You know, it used to be you'd walk downtown and you couldn't go 10 feet without seeing the bust of Mark Twain somewhere.
Right. Everybody loves Mark Twain.
Yeah.
I got a load of him when I was in school back in the 70s.
Yeah, he used to be required reading. I think
yes.
now his books have been banned.
Yeah, but really?
I think so. I think
oh,
they
wow.
banned Huckleberry Finn in some instances. And,
what did he do?
well, it's actually a race concern. I think some people would say that he may have shown some derogatory. One of the characters that Huckleberry Finn was friends with.
Okay.
I guess he was a slave, but I don't think Mark Twain was portraying him intentionally. And you know, I think he had a sympathetic view, but
okay.
I think some of the dialect, some would argue, is demeaning, and I understand that.
Right.
But as far as, you know, banning books, it's that's the day and age we live in, because we don't want to offend anyone.
Everyone's easily offended nowadays.
Yes, and you know, we're losing vital history. You know,
right.
Not all of it was going to be good history, but,
exactly.
but how else do we learn from it? You know, those who refuse to learn from history are doomed to repeat its mistakes.
Yeah, I believe that. Yeah.
So everyone loves Mark Twain, and you know, he has his place of honor. But we also, you know, as coming up, I started to learn about, you know, the prisoner camp, and I started to learn about the military rendezvous, because in addition to the prisoner of war camp, Elmira recruited soldiers to send to the war. So all over New York State, they would send them to Elmira for training. And that would be infantry, artillery, and cavalry. So they had 3 different camps for training. And so, especially after Lincoln signed the draft, you know, Elmira really became important to train these raw recruits and send them out.
Right.
So I just fell in love with the local history, and the more I researched, the more I just realized this story begs to be told. You know, what happened here. You know, to look at Elmira, it's almost, you know, almost flyover country now. You know, it really, we're not more than maybe 30,000 people. It's not a very big town.
Right.
But I think we have to remember our history and learn from it and celebrate what's celebratable. If that's a word.
Yeah.
And I just, every opportunity I can, I just love to talk about John W. Jones and the abolitionists. You know, they had a series of homes in Elmira that people would be able to come and hide and you know, take rest and take refuge, and then, you know, be sent on, because even though we're right at the bottom tier of New York, right on the border of Pennsylvania,
right,
it's that thin part of New York. We're central. We're called the southern tier. So directly north would be, you know, Canandaigua, right up to Canada. So,
right.
You know, it's even on foot or horseback, it's only a few days journey from Elmira to Canada. Nowadays, it's maybe a 2-hour drive.
Right.
So we were well situated. In addition to, you know, the railway. John W. Jones, of course, when he escaped, that was before railroad. He walked right up through Elmira.
Wow.
And he took refuge with a family, what we call now Pine City, which is basically southern Elmira. Took refuge in a barn, and the people were kind to him and introduced him to, I want to say it was Judge Ariel, but I may have his name wrong. So they introduced him to, you know, who's who, and he was embraced, and he was well loved and given, you know, work and given an education, and he never forgot. And there's a funny anecdote, if you don't mind. I'll take a little side trip. So John W. Jones, of course, as an abolitionist himself, he was very protective of people who were truly in need versus those who might try to scam the system. So this is kind of a funny thing. There was a freeborn man from Buffalo, because Buffalo even today is only about a 3-hour drive. he somehow came down to Elmira claiming that he was an escaped slave. And John W. Jones, smelled a rat. He thought, there's something not right here. And so he exposed this man publicly, and this man was driven out before receiving help and aid that he wasn't exactly entitled to. So, and some versions of the story say John actually literally kicked him.
Yeah, wow.
He was kind of a feisty guy.
Well, I guess some things never change because we got folks scamming the system right now.
Yes.
You know, and if you call them out, people are going to say, well, look how much money the government has, so what's the problem?
So yeah, he was passionate about helping people who truly needed it. And like I mentioned, he and his wife opened their home, and sometimes they would have up to 14 people in their little home at night, and there was nothing he wouldn't do. And that's so convicting to me, because I think, Lord, I pay my tithe, I give an offering, but he gave everything. And how, in what subtle ways do we hold back? And what is the measure of doing enough? I guess only God knows, and he leads us by his Spirit, and he puts us in situations. But I'm just so inspired when someone is just willing to give it all. And he
yeah, wow, that's amazing. Because when we think about it, Christianity in America, we got our problems, what you do, but Christianity over in other countries, they find out you're a Christian, they can take you around the back and shoot you in the head.
Yes.
And when we look at the two forms of Christianity, we in America start crying because, I'm the only Christian at work and blah, 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 blah. Really? Yeah. I'm like, suck it up, buttercup.
One of the friends I met when I was in college was from Nigeria, and he literally had his uncles, his father, his cousins assassinated. And he escaped, and he made it here. He was a wonderful Christian, still is. He travels through Europe giving crusades. And he would tell of not just the persecution, but the glory. I mean, the miracles, because Christians in some parts of the world can't just run to the doctor. They need God desperately in ways that Americans can't imagine.
Right.
And he was personal testimony, eyewitness to miracles. People, who couldn't walk suddenly get up and walk. And it's the level of desperation when we're calling on the Lord. And he says that, for people where he grew up, it was nothing, to believe that God could do these incredible miracles. But we in America sometimes find it a little harder to believe, because we've been so blessed materially. Right.
Plus, some of these fake killing ministries on television doesn't help out anyway. They kind of like, somebody talks about they got healed by the Lord. Next thing you know, somebody thinks they're trying to run a scam job on them or something. But
yes,
and that doesn't help out. If I had my way, I'd shut them all down right now. But
you're like my husband. My husband he's like a bloodhound. He likes to sniff out the scam artists.
Yeah. Well, you got to be that way, because when you think about the beauty of Christianity and the price that Christ paid, and to see some people just staining it with their activities and stuff, and it makes it hard to even testify to other people when they says, I saw you guys on television, I don't want no part of that. Well, that's not Christianity. I don't know what that is, but it's not Christianity. Not the Christianity I know about anyway.
No, there are prophets, and then there are profiteers.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
And I'm okay with, the prophetic gifting. I think that is legitimate, but I think that, those who would seek to gain from, using godliness as a means of gain, God actually says, from such withdraw yourselves.
Right.
So those are pretty hard words.
Yes, that's true. That's definitely true. Well, you make sure I get some links to your books, and just send me some links.
Yes, and I would love to send a signed copy to someone in your readership, your viewership. How could we do that? Should we have them leave comments, or what would you like for them to do in order to be entered?
I have to think about that, see how we can actually set that up. I'm sure somebody's going to want to get a copy of that book. Wow, I gotta sit on that and think about that for a minute.
Okay. All right.
But if you come up with something, let me know.
All right. So for a physical copy, a signed copy, would have to be within the United States. But if you have international listeners, I could send them an e-copy if they're selected as the winner.
Okay.
Okay.
I gotta figure out how I pull that off, because that's not really my area of expertise right there.
All right. All right. Well, what I've done on a podcast that I've been on in the past, it's also a blog. I'm not sure if you have a blog that corresponds with your podcast, but
not yet.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm open to suggestions, and I just want to, and if nothing else, I could send you a signed copy if you'd like that.
I love it.
All right. So we'll exchange emails, and that would be it. If someone were to enter, I would just need a way of getting a hold of them. So they'd probably have to leave their email or something. That I'd be able to get a hold of them.
Okay.
Well,
that sounds wonderful. So once again, tell us about your books.
Okay, so my first book is called The Abolitionist's Daughter, and it's part of the Sons of the Shenandoah series.
Okay.
Book 2 is called The Chaplain's Daughter, and book 3 is it's coming out Memorial Day, and it's going to be called No Man's Daughter. And I do have some other books that are not part of that series. I have a novella that was set in Manhattan during the draft riots. When Lincoln called the draft, there were some Irish folks that decided, and I'm Irish, so I'll pick on my people.
Yeah, that's an interesting history within itself, and I really need to do a study on that, because I hear so much about it, but I really want to do an in-depth study on the Irish and see what's really going on there, and where, because I know they came to America, they had the problems and issues too as well, and people don't talk about it a lot, unless you're Irish, of course, but well, as a whole, I don't hear a lot about it.
Unfortunately, during the draft riots, the Irish, many of them behaved very badly. They felt very oppressed, and they were, legitimately, but their response to it was not Christ-like. And not every Irishman, of course, but by and large, what had happened was when Lincoln called the draft, if you were wealthy, you could buy your way out. But if you were a poor immigrant, you would serve. And in fact, you could be hired by one of these wealthy people to take, their place. And that would be your choice. But if you were drafted as an Irishman, you knew you were going to be served. You would serve. And they cried foul because freedmen were exempt. African Americans in New York, or actually all over the North, were exempt from the draft.
Okay.
And so the Irish cried foul, and they felt that, it was unfair. And very tragically, Manhattan exploded in mob rule, and there were some very bad things that happened. Irish against the Black community. But there were also, and this is where my story focuses, there were some very heroic acts that there was a Black gentleman that owned a pharmacy. I think it was next to 5 Points, which was kind of, it was a section of Manhattan where the riots were especially bad.
Famous spot.
Yes. So all the Irish came out because this pharmacist had been so kind to them. They came out and formed a human chain and protected his pharmacy from the other rioters. So there was good spots. There were people that tried to do the right thing.
Right.
And so that's where my story focuses. It decries the bad behavior, but it also, shows that there's good and bad, even in horrible chaos and tragedy. So that's called Bachelor Buttons.
Okay.
And that's everything I've published is available on Amazon.
All right.
And I also have 2 novellas and some collections. One was a collection called Lessons on Love by Barber Publishing, and another one was called Victorian Christmas Brides collection.
Okay.
And that was also by Barber Publishing. So I
All
have a
right.
novella in each of those collections as well.
Well, you've been busy writing, haven't you?
It's been an adventure. It's been
How
a
long
really
have you been writing?
Oh, that's a story in itself. So I started when I was probably 13 years old, and most of
Okay.
what I wrote up until maybe 10 years ago wasn't worth it. But there was that one story stuck with me, and that was what eventually became the Sons of the Shenandoah series. So that experienced 30 years of revisions.
Wow.
So,
Wow.
yeah. So
Wow.
I'm a marathon runner, I think.
Wow. Well, that was my first dream, was to be a writer, until I picked up the guitar, and that changed everything.
See, I would trade. I love music. I love guitar. So
Yeah, I started playing the guitar when I was like 12 years old. So, I said, okay, forget about being a writer now.
you've chosen wisely.
But I didn't rock the world though, but
Well, all you
a lot of
need,
music, but didn't rock the world.
well, maybe it rocks the Lord. Maybe he loves your expression. So that's
Exactly.
wonderful.
So I asked all my guests 2 questions before I end the episode.
Okay.
First question: what's your favorite book of the Bible?
I would have to say Isaiah. I seem
Wow.
to, yeah, I love, one of my foundational chapters is Isaiah 54. And
Okay.
it always ministers to me. So I love Isaiah.
That's a powerful book. They call it the mini Bible.
Yes, yes.
66 chapters in it, and they also call it the 5th gospel.
That's interesting. I've
Yeah,
never heard
it's
that.
a very powerful book, very powerful.
Yeah, Isaiah
Yeah.
53 gives the whole salvation message,
Oh yeah, definitely,
Jesus' suffering. Yeah, it's amazing.
And my last and final question:
Okay.
what advice would you give my listeners right now? And you can choose any type of advice you want to give them.
Boy, that's a deep one. Stay close to the Lord. Listen for his still small voice. These are trying times. These are, like scripture says, times that try men's souls.
Yes, it is.
They would cause men's hearts to fail for fear. It
Yep.
says in the end times, and I think we're approaching that.
Yes, we are.
Just listen for his still small voice, because he will get us through no matter what. He's with us. He's for us. And if God be for us, who can be against us?
Exactly. That's good
I'm
advice.
so sorry. I should have muted my phone.
Oh, that's all right. I do that every time, all the time. I'm surprised it didn't go off today, but I made sure I turned it off for the first time.
You may have heard my dogs in the background too, so I apologize.
Well, I love dogs. So dogs get to bark all day long as far as I'm concerned.
Michael, it's been a delight to meet you and to be on your podcast. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for coming on the podcast and sharing with us. You have definitely enlightened me on an area I really didn't, that area I didn't know a lot about, as far as this gentleman we were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And with that being said, thank you for being on Clergy Talk Podcast, and I'm going to keep praying for you and your writing, and hope you touch people and enlighten their hearts. And I'm going to pray for you and your family. And with that being said, have a very blessed year.
You as well, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.